TFM.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5, our dedicated Enterprise podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing. Matthew, I am really glad that I wandered by your spacecraft and picked you up as you were floating in space today so we could podcast together.
I'm so glad you did too. I mean, I had no idea how long I was going to be out here, and honestly, power was starting to run a little low. It's getting kind of cold. So, do you have any, I don't know, anything warm to drink? Hot chocolate, bourbon, anything?
I think we could hook you up with some bourbon for sure.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and if you want to take in a movie, we've got, Sunset Boulevard's coming up next week, so we could watch that.
Excellent.
All right.
Excellent. Well, I've always wanted to see that too, so that's fantastic.
Well, I'm also glad that we figured out how to communicate with each other, because podcasting would be difficult if Hoshi did not get the UT working so quickly, because we're going to talk about Dear Doctor today as we continue our 20th anniversary rewatch. And here's a quick rundown of the episode. An alien astronaut leads the Enterprise crew to a planet in crisis. Two intelligent humanoid species live side by side, but one is suffering from a deadly disease. Unraveling the mystery puts Dr. Phlox and Captain Archer at odds as they decide whether or not to intervene in the development of another society. And Phlox shares all the details with his pen pal. So, that's of course only one part of this episode. Matthew, there's another very interesting part that we'll talk about along the way, but let's just start with the format. I mentioned he's sharing it all with his pen pal, Dr. Lucas, and the episode borrows this narrative style from the TNG episode Data's Day. I think it most closely mirrors that. What do you think about this way of telling the story to also let us get to know the Doctor a bit better?
I thought that this was a good opportunity to be able to do that, to really basically get inside Phlox's head in the same way that, when you're reading a book and it allows the reader to be inside the heads of the characters because you can be in there with their thoughts. And so in many ways, this is the easiest way to do that on screen with a character, them kind of narrating a story, and it allows them to be able to say things out loud that they might not necessarily get to do, like even just in conversations that you would have them in. And so I think this is the perfect way to be able to allow us further insight into Phlox, but really just to kind of see, obviously Phlox and T'Pol are the same type of character as like a Spock or, a Data or an Odo or, all of those type of characters that are on the outside looking in to humanity and to be able to kind of explore humanity from that perspective. And so I think that this format really gives us the opportunity to do what Star Trek does best, which is to be able to look at ourselves and see our reflection in that way.
Yeah, I think seeing things through Phlox's eyes, he talks about how the crew has been adapting to having an alien doctor aboard. And, Phlox has been on Earth, so it's not like Phlox has to get used to humans, but he does admit that he's still learning a lot about them. And being in close quarters like this, those dynamics change. And for much of the crew, I think being around aliens, certainly aliens other than Vulcans, is a new experience for them. So I think that's interesting. I like the narrative style. I actually, a few days ago, because we were going to talk about this, I went back and I rewatched Data's Day. And I just wanted to follow the story and also see like what else was going on in that episode while Data was recounting to Maddox his like experiences with everyday life with humans.
Right.
And I think that it's a nice way to tell a story. It's a little bit like in The Pale Moonlight on DS9, where we do get Sisko narrating, kind of recounting what had happened to him.
Yes.
This one's a bit different because we're actually learning in real time. He's writing it down for Lucas as it happens, as opposed to Cisco recounting what had happened. And also there's no log to erase at the end. But yeah, I like the format quite a bit. The other thing that's interesting in this episode, before we get into the heavier aspect of it, is the interest that crewman Cutler is showing in Phlox. And it ties in well to the situation that Phlox is in, where he's kind of trying to understand humans, their motivations, and work out what decisions to make. What did you think about that? And did it seem like it came out of nowhere in terms of Cutler's interest in Phlox?
I didn't feel like that at all, that it came out of nowhere. I think we've already seen her be quite curious in the time that she's been on Enterprise. And, I think what this allowed them to do is to begin to create more interest in her character. Again, it does really help us kind of get an opportunity to know Phlox because of her interest, because he divulges some personal information that he hasn't told anybody else here on the ship. And I think, too, their whole thought process, obviously, at this point, is that they wanted her to be more and more a part of the series. They wanted her to basically be in somewhat like Deep Space Nine, where we had those secondary characters who almost felt like primary characters. I think Cutler was meant to be that, obviously, for this series. And I love their relationship, their flirtation. And also, I think the beauty of kind of what she even says to him is that, look, I have no idea where this is going, basically, but I want to be your friend. And regardless of where it goes, my interest is in getting to know you and who you are. And I think that's really cool because, as Phlox talks about in the letter, the crew is starting to get more used to him. They're getting more comfortable with him. And we actually, one of the nice things is that we don't just tell the audience that's happening. We show the audience that that's happening through the relationship that he's developing with Cutler. Whether it becomes romantic or not is not necessarily the most important thing. What's important is that we're being shown somebody being interested in getting to know Phlox on a deeper level. And I think that's the thing that really makes this special. And the two characters, and the two actors, they just have some good chemistry together. They inhabit the screen well together. And I think that that's really enjoyable to watch. You always, that's one of the things about any show. The relationships of the cast outside of the show, it many times impacts the relationship they end up having on screen. And you can tell, like, that their chemistry is strong. So putting them together also has great story potential, not just romantically, but in the ways in which the thematic elements from their story have an impact and kind of reference what we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is the main thematic element of the episode.
Right. I thought it was interesting, too, that the situation with Phlox and T'Pol on the Enterprise is generally that they know more about what's going on than the human crew.
Right.
But this flipped it around so that it's actually Phlox who feels a bit like a fish out of water. He feels a bit uncomfortable. He doesn't know how to interpret things or how to react. And I thought that was a nice little bit of storytelling there. It also it's in a different scene. T'Pol and Phlox are talking about the Cutler situation, and T'Pol tells him that humans tend to be easily infatuated with things they find new. And if you just take that out of the context of what she's really saying, which is that they're not emotionally mature enough for interspecies relationships, I think that it's a good commentary on how humans think, and even more so today than when this episode was filmed. It's always the next new thing, right? Everybody's just moving on to the next new thing all the time. And so it's a little bit of timeless, maybe obvious, but timeless commentary by Star Trek. And yeah, it would have been interesting to see where they went with this relationship and these two characters if Kelly Waymeyer had not passed away and could have remained on the show.
Yeah, which is, the worst thing. I mean, I just remember when it happened and being kind of devastated just because I loved her on the show, and I really, wanted to see more of her. I thought she was fantastic. I loved her as the character, and and she was very young too.
Yeah, she was quite young,
only in her 40s. So,
and I see her turn up on other shows as well, as the different characters. And
I like that you pointed out the whole fish out of water thing that happens, because I also think that the conversation that Phlox and T'Pol have, I do think that this shows some of the bias that T'Pol has against humanity. I mean, that's her opinion, right? That humans aren't ready for this, but that's also Phlox's opinion of Archer in this episode, is that he's not ready. And he makes a point of saying, if I had not given him the opportunity to make the decision, I would have been doing the exact same thing that the Vulcans did to humanity all those years ago. And so in the end, trying to find your own way and allow people to find their own way is really important, I think. And so I loved that I think this is a really solid episode in the sense that it's very consistent with itself. It's very consistent in its worldview, and it's very consistent in the way in which these different characters are interacting with one another, and in the way that pretty much everything in the episode thematically is playing to the main theme. So this is one of the best episodes we've seen of Enterprise so far, just on that standpoint, when it comes to the way the writing is all working together to tell a full story, and every single part of the episode is a part of that, which, is what makes for the best television episodes of any show. So this is one of, I guess not to give away a rating, but this is one of the pinnacle episodes so far then of season 1, just because of that.
Right. Well, it's a good point, because even the romantic interest that Cutler is showing in Phlox, first of all, it gives the writers an opportunity to give us more information about Denobulans, their societal structure, their marriage. Also, they don't really get into the details, but there is that little bit back and forth with Dr. Lucas about reproduction, and Denobulan reproduction is very complicated. But the Cutler thing, there's the scene on the planet where Phlox reveals to her that he has 3 wives, and they talk about, well, cultures are different, so does it matter to you? And that is about a potential relationship between the two of them, but it completely ties in, as you say, to the main part of the story and what's going on in terms of, should we intervene or not intervene in another culture, or should we respect cultural differences? And it all ties together really well. Well, let's talk about these decisions, which is kind of the key part of everything that's going on. Phlox has a decision to make. Archer has a decision to make. On our outline, we have these as separate items, but I'm pretty sure they're all going to bleed together because they're all in the dialogue between the two characters. There's this tug of war between, should we help them or should we not help them? If we can find a cure, should we give them the cure? Of course, they want warp technology so they can go out and look for more people to help them. That was initially the more interesting part to me, and especially the fact that Archer was considering it, because at this point, humanity's experience in space is so limited that Archer isn't really thinking ahead about the repercussions of sharing technology like that with a less advanced culture. And also, T'Pol's response to the situation I found interesting, because she's weighing whether it would be okay or not okay to interact with this culture based on the fact that they've had contact with other warp-capable species. And again, we don't have a prime directive yet, although the end of this episode really pushes us towards that prime directive very strongly, the fact that there will be one day. So anyway, that was a long setup. What are your thoughts about this situation and how it evolves through the episode?
It's so interesting because the episode refers to the idea of like the creation of the prime directive one day. And, the prime directive is about not interfering with non-warp species. but this species already knows that warp technology exists because they've met other species. They are spacefaring people, but they're not a warp capable people just yet. And yet, what's interesting here is that it's about non-interference, and these people actually ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like this episode doesn't quite do the job that it wants to do, because these people are actually asking for help, and we have the ability to help them and give them what they're asking for. They don't need the warp technology because, well, we have the cure. And so we could just give them the cure. And I think the argument that Phlox and Archer have about the idea of evolution and everything, okay, but I don't really think that is... I think Phlox's argument is interesting, but I don't really agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think that just because the Menk are evolving and becoming smarter and everything does not mean that that relationship between them and the Vlakians can't continue to evolve and grow as well. And this, I mean, what's interesting is we'll actually see later on that with the Xindi, you can have a lot of different species,
right?
All evolve on a planet, and they all get along well enough. And so I think Phlox's argument is actually destroyed later on by the series when we meet the Xindi and realize, oh yeah, I mean, this is so. I just don't agree with Phlox in this. I think he makes the wrong choice. I think Archer makes the wrong choice. They said they're not here to play God, but their decision in the end plays God, right? Like,
sort of.
Yeah. Regardless of how you do this, you're playing God. And so if we're going to make that decision, I would rather err on the side of life and people surviving and them being able to figure it out rather than the other way around, because I don't, to me, that is where we've crossed a moral boundary that should be never crossed. Life should always be something that we work to protect. So, mm-hmm. I mean, that's just where I come from. And I mean, I think from a certain point of view and or a certain worldview, they're logically consistent. But my worldview and the worldview of the writers here is completely different. So, mm-hmm. I mean, that's just, I just don't agree. So, I mean, whereas I think the episode is interesting and good and creates an interesting conundrum, I think the actual answer here is wrong.
Okay. So let's break down what happens just to be clear and make sure I'm clear as well. So the Vlakians are suffering from a disease, but it's actually not exactly a disease. It's a flaw in their DNA. It's a natural flaw in their DNA. But Phlox can fix it,
mm-hmm.
but he also has a treatment that will ease the symptoms, but it won't actually fix the flaw. So they're still going to die later on, right. A few centuries later.
Unless they find
a
cure.
Okay,
yeah.
That's right. And so that's the Vlakian situation. Now, there's also the Mink, who seem to be evolving and becoming more intelligent. And if you look at it like in an Earth parallel, and this is probably not, scientifically probably not not an equal situation, but if you take maybe the two most advanced humanoid species that have lived on Earth, us, Homo sapiens, and the Neanderthal, we lived at the same time, and Homo sapiens survived and Neanderthals when it's extinct, although a lot of their DNA is in our DNA because we interbred. So the Mink are perhaps like the Neanderthal, and if the Homo sapiens had a genetic flaw and we were dying out, maybe the Neanderthal would have continued to evolve and they would have become the dominant species. Again, I'm not trying to get into like scientific accuracy here. It's just a bit of a parallel between worlds. So the situation is that if Archer and Phlox don't intervene, maybe the Vlakians die out and the Mink become a very advanced species hundreds of years or 1,000 years in the future, which could change all the dynamics of that area of space. So that's sort of the situation that we're in. And that's from the medical standpoint. Then there's maybe the Valachians see it as a quick fix of, we get warp technology and then we can go around looking for people, which would mean that a culture that's not really advanced enough yet to be interacting on a galactic scale would start interacting with other species, and what are the repercussions of that? Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the overall situation. So what you're saying is that, so what Archer ends up doing is he gives them the treatment that will ease the symptoms. He does not give them the cure that would fix the DNA flaw, and he does not give them warp drive. So basically, he has prolonged the interaction, the situation in which the Valachians are holding the mink down, although they're also providing for them, but they might be stifling their evolution.
Well, and I think that's the way that we see that here, but the Menk and the Valachians have obviously have a really nice equilibrium that they have worked on. Mm-hmm. As the Menk would advance, that would most likely have to change in some ways, right? Yeah. And so how that will change, we have no idea. Phlox says that what's going to happen is that they're going to keep them down, but he doesn't know that.
Right.
He's extrapolating and putting his own biases on there as well. So again, Phlox is playing God. Archer is playing God here. And the problem is that they're not out here to play God. They got asked for help, and they have the ability to fix this, and their presuppositions about what may or may not happen on this planet are actually what are getting in the way. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying is that there's a complete flaw in Phlox's logic, because he doesn't actually know that that's going to happen.
Right.
And again, like we, they might not be ready for warp technology, but that doesn't mean they're not ready for the cure, and that they can't make good decisions going forward. I mean, to me, what's so interesting about the episode is that we really do see that so far this society on all sides seems to have made good decisions. Mm-hmm. And so to say that they're not going to make good decisions from now on, it seems counter to the very little we know of them. So I really think that the episode, it misses some interesting and some key points that I wish somebody would have brought up, which is to say, hey, we don't actually really know what's going to happen. All we have here is the decision we make now. And the decision that Archer makes now it's decent in the sense that it does give them a chance. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're saying there's a chance, but he still, in many ways, does the very thing he said he didn't want to do, which is to play God. And he does play God here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's difficult to be in that position in the sense that life and death situations are always going to be tough. But I do think that the reason I think he makes the wrong decision is that the decision to be best made is one that always focuses on preserving life, and here he doesn't make that decision. He actually makes a decision that could lead to mass extinction, and I don't think that's the right decision.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a case of humans grappling with how to make decisions, because it's one thing to make. Science fiction is a parallel for human society, so it's easy to write stories where we're talking about how do we handle things within our own species on Earth.
Right.
How do we handle things directly? But when you start talking about us intervening, and then you could write a story where there are no humans involved. If the story were just about the Valachians and the mink, and there was a Valachian scientist who realized what was going on and was trying to solve it in some way, and there were different nation states involved, and then you could tell the story maybe in a way that the resolution could make sense or could be sound, or you could clearly see a way out. Yeah, here it's sort of a no-win scenario for them, because if they give them the cure, then they don't know what will happen, but in their eyes, they've irrevocably altered the course of this planet's history. Right. Now,
and they already have, even just by giving them the prolonged, medication. Yeah. So again, since we don't know the repercussions of our actions, but I think that's where it's like, okay, so what are our principles? Archer's talked about that. What is our morality? And to me, our morality should be that, well, we err on the side of life always. Mm-hmm. And so if there's a chance that these people can survive, then we should err on that side, and then let history make its decision as to what happens on this planet. That they'll have to hopefully make good decisions, but we should at least give them that chance.
Well, and I think that was Archer's first reaction. And then as the story goes on, he starts to consider more about what may or may not happen, especially because Phlox is explaining to him situations that could happen that maybe Archer initially didn't think of. Because Phlox, he writes to Dr. Lucas that the captain is directing all of our resources to helping people that we didn't even know. Mm-hmm. So, see, Archer's view evolves as well. So the other option, though, is to do nothing and just leave.
Right.
I think that probably as humans, we both agree that would be morally wrong, especially because they've already asked for help. If you just discovered something and the people didn't know you existed, it might be easier, but I think still it would be kind of hard to know that you could help someone who's suffering and you choose not to. But if you interpret it gets a bit gray here because they've already encountered warp-capable species. But if you get into
and that's where I don't think that I completely agree with Archer in the sense of not giving them warp technology, because again, that's something I feel like that has to be earned, right? To understand how to use that type of power. I think that's where, to me, it's like that's not even a question. The question about the cure is a completely different question to me, and one that, again, I think when you talked about like the idea of like, okay, what we couldn't just leave and do nothing, because that would be wrong. People ask for our help, and so I think the idea that we as a species wouldn't hold to our moral ideas out there. And, they bring the whole idea of like different cultures, right? With Phlox, but I find that to be a bit of a red herring, because it's not that's apples and oranges, comparing the idea of like whether the idea of marriages and how families work and all that kind of stuff. That's a little bit different than the idea of the discussions of life and death. Mm-hmm. It's completely different. Yeah. So, they try to marry the two as if they are the same, but it's not. So,
yeah, I didn't see it so much as trying to say that they're both the same, but rather it was just, in that situation, Cutler represents humanity, and Phlox is just trying to tell her, like, think a little bit outside your own experiences when you're dealing with another situation.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, again, too, this really is a huge question, because I would say that obviously, the way that this is written, the worldview that it's coming from is one of probably more of a moral relativistic state. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a moral relativist. So, and that's not my worldview. And therefore, I'm not going to agree with a lot of the things in this episode because I don't believe that to be the case, right? And that's the thing about the episode is the way that it sets itself up is that it's making lots of assumptions about things and basing a lot of things on assumptions to which it can't actually prove that will happen. And so the base question then of whether or not we help these people and give them a cure or not is really the biggest question. The problem is that I feel like the answer they come to is one that's based off of a lot of assumptions that we can't prove whether or not they will actually happen, and therefore don't actually answer the question well then of whether or not we should help them or not.
So I think that's where the prime directive comes into play in the future when there is a prime directive and what they're getting, what Archer is moving towards when he talks about the fact that there will be some kind of directive or principles is that you're right. You can't, you can make assumptions, but you cannot know. So they're just assumptions, right? So if you base your decisions on assumptions, it's not a very sound way to make a decision, especially when you're talking about life or death or intervening in the development of another culture or another civilization. And you see that here on Earth too, where you have, throughout history, countries have intervened in other cultures by making assumptions based on their own experiences and worldviews that maybe didn't turn out well for the culture that they went into. And this is just grafting that over into space. So what I was going to say a moment ago is that the other option is to do nothing, to just leave. And if you really interpret the prime directive by what I think it's intended to be, a non-interference directive, that would be the only decision that Archer could make, would have been to leave and do nothing. Don't give them any medicine to ease the symptoms. Don't give them a cure. Don't give them more technology. Just say, I'm sorry, I cannot help you, and leave.
Right.
That's what he should have done based on the prime directive. And again, I keep reiterating, we know there's no prime directive yet, but this is Star Trek, and the story is designed to set up the development of the prime directive. So that's what
100%.
That's what Starfleet, that's what the Federation would have Starfleet captains do. But we know that's not what happens. Right. Look at Kirk, look at Picard, look at Janeway, look at Sisko. Right. They don't follow the prime directive in that strict manner either. And so I think the idea of the prime directive is that you remove assumptions from the equation. Right? You can't make a decision based on assumptions. And so you remove yourself from the situation, because otherwise you're always going to be making decisions on some sort of assumptions.
Well, I do think, and this is interesting, because that question about, just in the end, about the prime directive is the assumption that we shouldn't interfere because of, I guess, natural selection or evolution or yada, yada, yada. Like, and again, that's it's an assumption, and that's where, in a situation like this, it's like the prime directive, I don't even think as it's applied in the future would actually apply here, because these people literally asked for help. It wasn't as though we're not interfering in natural evolution or anything, because these people literally asked for help. And so again, it becomes about the question that Phlox raises about what might happen in the future. But what might happen in the future is not something that we can determine. All we can do is something about the here and now. And so, So it's an interesting point, because some people might say that, well, if you give them the cure or even medication, you are interfering with natural evolution. You could look at it that way. However, they asked for help. They did that themselves. Therefore, that is part of their natural course, their natural evolution. So if we give them help after they asked for it, we're not interfering anymore, because they are the ones who initiated it. Therefore, it is part of their natural course of existence, right? That's something I think is often lost in Star Trek discussions about interference or the prime directive, is it's always viewed from our side,
right? That we're helping, we're giving something, we're intervening. Doing so is changing the course of something, not considering the fact that any action initiated by the other side is part of their natural course.
I think you've said that beautifully, and I think it's 100% true. And I think the other thing here is that, Phlox says that, well, the Mank could become the dominant species on this planet. Okay, well, that's a possibility, yes, in who knows how long, right? But you already see the Valachians taking care of the Mank because so far in their evolution, they have not been able to do so. But now they're gaining the opportunity to do so. And so I don't understand why you wouldn't just tell the Valachians, hey, here we got this cure for you. And we've noticed that the Mank are ready for more. And this is the point where I do think you could say, hey, we would like to bring some people to help you make this, the right choices here, like the Vulcans did with us. Or just be like, hey, the dynamic here is going to change between you in the sense that it's going to become less them needing you to do things for them and more that, well, you guys are going to be able to work on things together. I think there's something about this that we don't even think about discussing because we just want to, quote unquote, let, I guess, natural selection take its course. But it's like we're rational beings who have the ability to obviously impact and help others. Like, I don't think, again, like you said, they've asked for help. We're not interfering. We're just entering into their lives because of their choices. And let's help them continue to make good choices, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that they really just they miss a big part of the discussion here, and it's one of the reasons where I think the episode is internally consistent from one point of view, but I think there's a lot of other points of view that just don't get discussed here, and that's too bad.
Yeah. So I have 2 points I want to bring up. One is about them asking for help, and just to clarify even more so, they literally built ships and went into space to look for help. Okay, so it's not just like asking for help, like, let's say Starfleet has a hidden base, with the Mintakans, and something happens and the Mintakans figure out, oh, you're aliens, here's a problem we have, can you please help us? It's not that situation where they sort of accidentally encountered humans and then asked for help with something. This is a case of, we need help. What are we going to do? Let's send some ships out into space and hope maybe we can find somebody who can help us. So it's a very deliberate act on their part to go look for help, not just ask for help. So that's a big difference in how you view whether or not we would be interfering by responding to the request for help. The other thing I was thinking about is this story would probably work better as a movie where you have more time to get into more details, because one thing that is hinted at in the episode but isn't brought up is that I suspect that the Valachians fear the mink. They are helping them, but the mink also mentioned that the Valachians don't let us live on the fertile land, for example. So I think that Valachians, certainly some Valachian scientists, are well aware of the mink's trajectory of mental development and are fearful of what that would mean for their that equilibrium between their species in the future. Yeah. And that very much would play into a request for help, as well as the morality of humans deciding to change, deciding to help, and then potentially changing that course of evolution. Right. But that's not in the episode. And that, I think, would, if we knew that, if it were part of the story, might change the discussion or view a bit.
Well, and I think that's what Phlox is referring to, in without saying all of that, that idea. But again, that is conjecture,
right?
You know, and he's extrapolating. And I think what's interesting here is that Phlox and Archer both say that the majority of species that they've run into, there's only been one dominant species on the planet, right? They're assuming, though, again, they're making assumptions that it can't be different, that it can only go one way. And I challenge those assumptions by saying, why can't it? And we'll see it later in Enterprise that it can. And so it's like, I get frustrated that these assumptions that we make become these kind of like laws, these unmovable things, as if assumptions are reality. And that's just not the case. And I find it intellectually dishonest of the episode to say, well, we're making these assumptions about the way we believe science to work, as if science is something in concrete and not always in flux and always changing, because we're always learning new things.
Right.
And that, you know, yeah, there are certain things that are laws in science, but there are very few laws in science. Very few. The rest of them are all things which we're constantly adding to our understanding of. And so
right.
That's the thing that I think this episode really does, is that it makes a lot of assumed knowledge like concrete knowledge, and that's something that we shouldn't do as humankind, especially if we really do want to be open to moving and growing and learning and moving. If we were truly moving out there in the universe and meeting different species, we would really have to have a truly open mind. And what I see here is that Phlox has a pretty closed mind, actually, about how he thinks the universe works.
Right.
And he's passing that closed mind on to Archer. And to me, that bothers me the most.
Well, that's because Phlox is being written by a human. It's
exactly.
I mean, as much as I love Star Trek, and as much as Star Trek tries to break out of this mold, it is ultimately human-centric storytelling.
Sure.
And it's actually, I know a lot of listeners won't want me to say this, but it is very U.S. American-centric storytelling as well, which is easy to see if you are American, as I am, but you've spent most of your life outside of that culture. You can see how the views are applied to the storytelling and is set in space. But of course, we're humans, so we're writing it. Right. Of course, it's going to be human-centric. And it's very difficult to break out of that as a writer and tell something that is truly broader or more open-minded. And it's also difficult to connect with a broad audience in that sense. But I think that this episode, as we go into final thoughts and rating here, I think that this episode, among Star Trek episodes, does raise a lot of interesting questions, even if it doesn't answer them in a way that's satisfactory to every viewer. But at least it's not as much of a black and white morality play as a lot of episodes are.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the Enterprise episodes we've had, you know, the thought process behind it, the questions it's raising, and all those kind of things, I think make this, closer to a 4.5 out of 5. Because of that, I can watch it and enjoy it for it being Star Trek, and I think being good Star Trek, because again, I talked about the writing being internally consistent, having all the themes really work well together in this episode. I do just think that it is less open-minded than it actually thinks it is. It's actually much more closed-minded, and for that, it's frustrating. And I honestly think, you know, it's so fascinating. You mentioned about the way episodes are written and everything, and it's something that I see in just fandoms in general. Like, people become very closed-minded to things, and accuse others of being closed-minded when really they're being more open-minded. And so it's just because we want to hold to our preconceptions and or our thoughts about how things work. And it really comes down to the end of like, what are you putting your faith in? And, if everything is malleable, then it's hard to have anything that's concrete that we can really say yes or no to, or right or wrong to. And that's an interesting thing. So all of that, it makes for, again, we've had such a fascinating discussion. So I really think this has been one of the better episodes of Enterprise so far.
Yeah, I agree. I've always liked this episode. I like the structure of it. I like the questions that it raises. And I like the fact that at the end of it, we can have this discussion about, did they do the right thing? Did they do the wrong thing? And what might they have done that could have made the story more interesting, and even better? But I still think it's a great episode of Enterprise and Star Trek. So I'm going to give it 9 unexpected kisses on the cheek.
Perfect.
All right. Well, we would love to hear your thoughts on Dear Doctor. If you'd like to share those with us, there are many ways to do that. The best way is to join the Babel Conference on Facebook. That's our closed listeners group. It's just for listeners. If you're not already a member, just type Babel, Babel, into the search field, and it should come up. If not, just type the Babel Conference. As I mentioned, it is a closed group, so you'll be asked some questions so that we know that you are a listener. And you also need to agree to the rules of the forum so that I can let you in. If you would like to send us email, you can do that by going to trek.fm/contact and using the form there. Choose to send to a show and choose Warp 5, and that'll come to Matthew and me by email. And if you'd like to find us elsewhere in social media, you can find us on Twitter, where our username is TrekFM, as well as on Instagram, also TrekFM. That's our username everywhere. Now, Matthew, when you're not writing letters to your favorite pen pals, where can people find you?
Well, of course, you could find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02, whether that's Instagram, Twitter, Vero, all those different types of places you can find me. You can also find me here on the network, on our whole other side of the network we have called the 602 Club. And that's where we discuss all the things that aren't Star Trek related because, well, there are just so many fandoms out there that we'd like to touch base with, and we get to do that there. We've got a couple of bonus shows we do there as well. One's called Snyder Cuts, and the other's called Assembling Avengers, as we can kind of continue to grow the network. So again, just check out the 602 Club. You can also find me here doing a couple of other shows. One is called Literary Treks, and that's about the books and the comics of Star Trek. And then Chris, we also do together The Orb. When we get a chance, we talk about Star Trek Deep Space Nine together, which is a lot of fun. And then you can find me over on the Nerd Party Network. I do a few shows there. One is called Owl Post. That is a completed show I did with Drea Kaufman where we talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And then I'm also doing Aggressive Negotiations with the great John Mills as we talk about Star Wars each and every week. But Chris, if people want to, maybe talk some Enterprise with you or anything else that you've got going on, where would they find you?
Well, the best place to find me is on Twitter. That is my preferred platform, although I am on other social media platforms. My username is C. Bryan Jones, letter C, and Bryan with a Y. That's my username everywhere. But Twitter is the best place to catch me, and I would love to chat with you about Enterprise or Star Trek in general or college football or technology or whatever you want to talk about. I would love to hear from you there on Twitter. And elsewhere on the network, I have The Ready Room, which I do with Larry Nemechek, and we have an episode out now where we're looking back at the first 2 seasons of Lower Decks. And also, Matthew, you mentioned Literary Treks and The Orb. So if you enjoy our discussions about Enterprise here, if you enjoy this type of discussion and you're a Niner and you don't already know about The Orb, go over and check us out there. And then I have Interphase and a few other things I'm working on. And we're working on other behind the scenes things for the network that is ongoing. So I would love to hear from you. So drop me a line. And if you would like to help us keep Warp 5, the 602 Club, all the shows on the network going, we could definitely use your help. through Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, you can find out how to get involved in the network, become an associate producer, help us in other ways. We really appreciate everyone who's supporting us now. We would not be able to publish these shows without your help. So thank you very much for all your support. Well, Matthew, it's been a great discussion today, but I need to go and do something, but I want to be very careful because there's some sleeping dogs in the other room, and we're not going to talk about them until next week.
Well, Chris, I think you should be careful, and I guess let's go carefully.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5, our dedicated Enterprise podcast. I'm Christopher Jones, and with me, as he always is my esteemed Matthew. It's my esteemed Matthew. Okay. And with me, as he always is my esteemed co-host, Matthew Rushing.